This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 14. Henry IV of France. With the opening of the 17th century, the Reformation enters its second phase. Its first had been a universal struggle to determine whether the faith should be retained by all Europe or lost by all Europe. The struggle had been accompanied in Spain by violent repressions, in the Germanies by local conflicts, compromises, and conferences, in France by violent civil war. In England, the faith had been worsted by the consistent pressure against it of government, and with the loss of England and Scotland under English power, the chance of a complete victory for Catholicism was lost. It was lost by 1606. Henceforward, we have in all Europe a second phase, more political and less religious than the first, a division of Europe into two parts, Catholic and Protestant, which gradually crystallized and became permanent. France fell after its exhausting civil war onto the Catholic side, but not thoroughly. The weakened combatants had ended by a compromise. Henry IV of France was the typical figure of the compromise. He is symbolic of the way in which the great religious struggle of the 17th century in Europe was going to end. It had long looked as though, one, it would end either by the complete dislocation of Catholicism and its replacement by a mass of Protestant sects, the enthusiasm of which would soon die away and leave civilization in ruins, or as though, two, the Catholic reaction would set in and would save the situation completely, as though the states and cities which had rebelled against religious unity and looted church wealth were going to be reconquered by Catholicism, partly through missionary work, but more through the victory of the Catholic princes and populations in the religious wars. But in point of fact, neither of these solutions took place. The great struggle ended in a draw without a decision. Towards the middle of the 17th century, round about 1650, the two cultures were now firmly established, each in its own region, and were left each facing the other. The Catholic culture failed to re-establish itself completely through Christendom. The Protestant culture did not spread itself, as it had hoped, throughout all Christendom. The first symptom of what was going to happen took place in France at the beginning of this last phase, that is, a little before the year 1600, after the religious wars. The struggle between the old religion and its enemies had been going on for a whole lifetime, and fierce fighting, civil wars, popular revolts, etc., connected with the quarrel had extended over 50 years. The active government of the French people had lain for many centuries in the hands of a royal family called the Capetian House. From their founder, Hugh Capet, who was the first king of that dynasty in France. The French monarchy had a strict rule of succession, whereby the next male heir must take the throne upon the death of the last king. The French crown could not be inherited by a woman or even through a woman. For some hundreds of years it had gone from father to son without a break. Then the last king had no surviving son, only a daughter, and the same was true of his brother, who succeeded, so that the next male heir was only a cousin. Though his cousin was of the Capetian house, he had a special title of his own, Valois, and the kings descended from this cousin were called the House of Valois. Now, just when the Reformation quarrel was at its height, just at the moment when Queen Mary was trying to restore Catholicism for good in England, and the emperor in Germany was doing all he could to keep the peace between two sides, it became clear that the Valois line was going to fail also. There was a succession of three sickly young men, none of whom had heirs, or probably could have had heirs. The nearest male heir was a distant cousin, and to find a common ancestor between him and the reigning king, one had to go back nearly 300 years. This distant cousin belonged to a junior branch of the Capetian house, which had the title of Bourbon. From their lands in the center of France, Anthony de Bourbon, the head of the family, at the time when these sickly Valois boys were successively occupying the French throne, happened also to be king of a little Basque district on the extreme boundaries of France, just beyond the southern frontier, called Navarre. Being the next heir, he declared in favor of the Protestant cause, and his young son Henry, who was a fine soldierly young man, very different from his sickly Valois cousins, was brought up to be a Protestant. Something like half the nobility of France had also joined the religious revolt, hoping, like their fellows and contemporaries, the English squires, to make a good thing out of it by looting the church land as had been done in England, Scotland, northern Germany, and Switzerland. They therefore began attacks upon the regular government of the Valois kings who stood for the old orthodoxy. These attacks, from skirmishes and plots against individual lives, developed into regular civil war, called in the history of France the Wars of Religion. The French Protestant rebels were called Huguenots, and this heir presumptive to the throne, Anthony de Bourbon, King of Navarre, was the head of the faction. The most powerful man, however, among the Huguenots was one of the three wealthy Coligny brothers known as the Admiral, because he was the Admiral of France, that is, supervising naval business and drawing his revenue from wreckage, prize money, etc., while his opponent, the most powerful man of the Catholic side, was the Duc de Guise of the House of Lorraine. The Coligny faction had murdered a Guise, and the Guise therefore watched to destroy the power of Coligny and his Huguenot followers. The crown, which was really run not by the succession of sickly boys, but by their mother, Catherine de' Medici, a woman of great energy and intelligence, was determined to be subject neither to the one faction nor the other, and the most dangerous one at the moment was that of the Huguenots under Coligny. If they were sufficiently successful in the rebellious war, they might come to command the whole country, change its religion, and of course, loot all the church wealth, and become, as the English squires became in their turn, more powerful than the crown itself. It happened that a great number of Huguenots had come up to Paris to assist at the wedding of young Henry Bourbon, son of the King of Navarre, to the sister of the reigning king, who was Catherine de' Medici's daughter. Coligny, plotting actively, was in Paris also, threatening the crown. The Queen Mother determined, therefore, to have him assassinated. The populace of Paris, already intensely exasperated against the Huguenots, who were chiefly powerful in the south of France, seized the opportunity, and this first attack on Coligny was the sign for a general rising of the whole people of Paris on a scale which no one had expected. The people chased the Huguenot gentlemen out of their houses, and murdered them in the street, where there was a massacre of them and their servants. In great public disturbances of this sort, many of course fall who are little connected with the real issue. Debtors take the opportunity of getting rid of their creditors, and jealous men of their rivals. It is not known how many were killed altogether, but the probable number of victims in Paris was 2,000, and there were risings in many other towns as well. This violent outburst of popular feeling against the gentry who were fomenting civil war is known as the Massacre of St. Bartholomew, because it began on the vigil of St. Bartholomew's Day and continued on the day itself, August 22nd and 23rd of 1572. It is probable that this date for attacking the Huguenots was chosen and did not come haphazard. The Huguenots had been guilty of a particularly treacherous murder of Catholics on this same day, St. Bartholomew's Day, 3 years before, and it is said that the royal family had sworn to have the revenge. Anyhow, it is generally known in history as the St. Bartholomew. The young Henry of Bourbon saved his life with difficulty. The massacre had a double effect. It exasperated the religious wars, of course, adding a powerful motive of vengeance to the original motive of religious difference, which was mainly avarice on the part of the Huguenot nobility, but it also had the effect of frightening the Huguenot faction, who had not guessed how violent the popular anger against them was. It showed that the temper of Paris, which counted for so much in those days in French affairs, was now definitely turned against the Reformation, and that the capital would have none of it, regarding those who supported it as traitors and rebels and public thieves. The religious wars went on with great violence. Old Anthony de Bourbon, the King of Navarre, died, and his son Henry succeeded him, but continued to lead the Huguenot forces in the Civil War. The last of the Valois brothers was now king, under the title of Henry III. His health was bad. He could certainly have no children, and he recognized Henry of Bourbon, the new King of Navarre, who was his cousin, as his heir. But Paris was so angry with the Protestant faction, and so for that matter was the greater part of the country, that it refused to accept Henry of Navarre as its future king. It even preferred to break with the immemorial tradition of having the male head of the Capetian house of for the monarch, and prepare to put a younger heir upon the throne. The principle of strict hereditary monarchy in the male line was so strong in France at the time that this seemed a desperate resolve. The king, Henry III, left his capital and took refuge with his cousin, Henry of Navarre, and together they besieged Paris from outside. A private man who was particularly excited against the Huguenot faction asked for an interview with the king, was granted it, and used the opportunity to stab Henry III to death. With the death of the last Valois, Henry of Navarre was legitimate king of France. He had the powerful Huguenot army at his service, and because he had hereditary right on his side, though still a Protestant, numbers of the Catholic gentry joined him as well. The action of Paris in preferring religion to hereditary right was odious to them, but Paris held out and formed the center of resistance to the Bourbon. Up to this point, it had seemed probable that Henry of Navarre would make good his right to the succession, and that France would have a Protestant king. If that should take place, all the Protestant leaders, who were quite half the nobility of the country, would have received a great accession of power. A general loot of church lands would certainly have begun after the pattern of what had happened in England, and probably the faith would have ultimately been lost to France. Had France gone Protestant, the center of gravity in Europe from being with the Catholic culture would have passed to the Protestant culture. What saved the situation was the continued tenacity of the people of Paris. Although Henry of Navarre was still victorious, they were determined not to give way, and though they were subjected to a most horrible famine, they refused to yield. At last, it was Henry of Navarre himself who gave way. He may or may not have used the famous words, "Paris is worth the Mass," but these words certainly expressed his sentiments. He himself, like most of his rank in those days, had no real religion. The Huguenot preachers whom he had to listen to bored him intensely. He was a very loose liver, much attached to his pleasures, the very opposite of a Puritan. He had the virtues of a soldier, but no real faith in any doctrine. He judged that it would be better, after all, to accept the religion of the bulk of his subjects, as, unless he did so, he might never be allowed to reign in peace. This decision of Henry of Navarre to become Catholic was, as I have said, the first act of the great compromise by which Europe ultimately settled down into two opposing cultures, Catholic and Protestant. It marked the victory of popular Catholicism in France and the end of the chances which once had stood so high of Protestantism capturing that country. But the thing was not a Catholic victory by any means. It was what I have called it, a compromise. Henry's old comrades in arms retained their violent opposition to Catholicism. His right-hand man, Sully, who worked his finances and was even more avaricious than most of the Huguenot set, was an example in point, and on all sides the Huguenots retained great political power. The new king further favored them with the object of retaining their support and reigning peaceably, by issuing an edict known to history as the Edict of Nantes, or Nantes. Under this arrangement, a very large measure of toleration, and something a good deal more than toleration, was granted to the Huguenots. They were allowed to hold a certain number of strong towns and to garrison them and govern them independently, and thus form a sort of kingdom within the kingdom. So while in England Catholics were persecuted to the death, though still some half of the population, in France the Protestants, though but a small minority outside the noble class, were given all these advantages. They could practice their religion, of course, but, what was much more important politically, they could and did hold these strong places independently when they could make war against the crown and threaten the mass of their fellow citizens. They had, in particular, among these strong towns, that of La Rochelle, an important seaport on the Bay of Biscay, which was as though in England at that time, it was toward the end of the reign of Elizabeth, the Catholics had been allowed to hold Portsmouth and, say, Chester, York, Leicester, and a number of other walled towns in the kingdom. So stood the compromise when Henry IV in his turn was stabbed by another half-witted and fanatical defender of the Catholic cause who, quite rightly, doubted the king's sincerity. Henry IV, the first Bourbon king, died thus in the year 1610. France was not, at his death, a fully Catholic country. On the contrary, it had become, through his action, a country in which a powerful anti-Catholic faction, counting many of the richest families in the kingdom, was tolerated and held important strongholds, as well as having the right to combine and put up effective resistance to the mass of the nation. The ultimate result of thus establishing a dualism of religion was a current of French opinion which in the course of 2 more generations began to shift from Protestantism to a skeptical form of anti-Catholicism. But still, take it for all in all, the Catholic culture of France had been saved by Henry of Bourbon's abjuration, and that king, known to history as the Henri IV, had not, though not intending to do so, saved the civilization of the country and of Europe, though hardly. While this was going on in France, Henry's contemporary in England, James I, was giving an example of a different kind. He was establishing the Protestant doctrine of the divine right of kings, which has become in course of time the modern doctrine of the supremacy of the state over the church, and civil power over the religious power. How James I represented this, I will explain in the next chapter.